Nicolette, one of the main points in your book, or one of the main messages, is in regards to animal agriculture and environmental law, and how these big agribusinesses bypass the laws. And I'm hoping that you can touch a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that surprises a lot of people is to learn that there are laws that actually restrict the activities of big animal confinement operations, because there don't seem to be any, because they seem to be operating without any real restrictions. And for the most part, there are minimal restrictions. But the interesting thing is that the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and some of the other big federal environmental laws actually do apply to these operations. They're just not being enforced. So they're kind of universally getting around these laws. And I was actually the attorney for the environmental group Waterkeeper Alliance when we were in federal court against Smithfield Foods, arguing that very point. And the federal judge in the case agreed with us wholeheartedly that the Clean Water Act and these other federal environmental laws clearly apply to these operations. And the interesting thing is, when you go through the legislative history of these laws and when you go through the regulatory history, it's clear that they were from the start intended to restrict the activities of these big operations. But they're universally not being enforced. So there's been a little bit of improvement of that, but basically in all 50 states, they're operating with almost no laws being applied to them. And so even though they operate like factories and they produce all this prodigious waste in the same way that a factory produces waste, they just basically put their waste out into the environment without any regulations being applied to them, without any treatment of the waste. It's not really what the law says, but it's the reality on the ground, because the regulators, the state environmental agencies and the federal EPA are not enforcing the law.
Why?
Well, it really boils down to politics. There's a huge amount of money behind big agribusiness, and that's where all of their farming operations is in those kind of big confinement operations. Whereas the traditional farmer that operates with a smaller scale farm with a small herd of animals and will have his animals out on pasture, and so they don't have these big pollution problems, they don't have any political clout in Washington. And so you don't get more laws that we probably need on the books, and you don't get enforcement of the laws that are on the books. The Environmental Protection Agency is the federal agency that should be dealing with this, and they just literally don't get the funding. And so if you don't have the political support for enforcing a law, it's as good as no law.
What can people do? What can be done?
Well, I think one of the most important things that people should be doing is urging the enforcement of the existing laws. And that's such a modest request. You know, I think if people asked their legislators, and especially in an organized way, if organizations got together and kind of demanded the enforcement of the Clean Water Act, the enforcement of the Clean Air Act against confinement animal agriculture, that would have a huge impact. And that's again, I just think that's such a modest request to ask our legislators, both our state legislators and our federal legislators, to enforce the law, and they should make sure that happens.